The emergency alert tone didn't just interrupt the music. It stayed for nearly a minute, a flat, dead frequency that made the fillings in my teeth ache. I was deep into the mountain pass, miles from any town, when the tone finally cut to a local broadcast. The voice was low, rhythmic, and accompanied by a constant, metallic clicking, like someone rhythmically tapping a heavy brass pen against a desk. The announcer didn't give a weather report. He described the contents of my glove box. He listed the expired registration, the half-empty pack of gum, and the silver locket I'd hidden in the back. My hand flew to the latch, but it was jammed solid. The voice chuckled, noting that some things were meant to stay buried until the collection was ready. I checked the rear view. For miles there had been nothing, but now a single pair of yellow fog lights sat 100 yards back. They didn't move like a car. They stayed perfectly level, unaffected by the potholes or the steep grade. I accelerated to 70, then 80, but the distance stayed exactly the same. The radio hissed, the clicking of the pen growing faster and more aggressive. The voice told me that the yellow lights were a visual tether, that as long as I could see them, I was part of the broadcast. I looked away, trying to focus on the dark road ahead, but the radio immediately emitted a piercing screech that forced my eyes back to the mirror. The voice warned me that looking away was a breach of contract. A heavy thump vibrated through the frame of the car, and the rear suspension suddenly groaned, sagging as if 300 pounds of lead had just been dropped into my trunk. I fishtailed, the car struggling to maintain speed under the sudden, phantom weight. The voice on the radio grew excited, narrating the way my tires were beginning to smoke under the burden. He called the weight the archive, a collection of every regret and secret I'd tried to outrun, physically manifesting to slow me down for the harvest. I realized then that the radio wasn't just observing me. It was weighing me down until I was stationary enough to be collected by the yellow lights. The clicking of the pen stopped. The silence was worse. The voice whispered that the yellow lights would only go out when the weight in my trunk reached its limit. I reached out to smash the radio face, but my fingers passed right through the plastic as if it were smoke. The dashboard clock began to run backward at a blurring speed, the years of my life ticking away as the car grew heavier and heavier. I was flooring the gas, but the sedan was crawling at 20 miles per hour now, the rear bumper nearly scraping the asphalt. The voice told me that the only way to shed the weight was to give the broadcast something new, something I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. The tunnel loomed ahead. The radio announcer's tone shifted to one of desperate urgency, the pen clicking returning as a frantic, jagged sound. He told me that the tunnel was a dead zone, a place where the broadcast couldn't reach, and if I made it inside, the archive would be lost to him. The yellow lights behind me flared, doubling in size and brightness, the heat from them beginning to blister the paint on my tailgate. I steered with everything I had, the car groaning under the impossible weight in the trunk. I crossed the threshold into the concrete mouth of the tunnel, and the radio instantly died. The car surged forward, the phantom weight vanishing so suddenly that I nearly hit the tunnel wall. I drove until I reached the bright lights of a 24-hour gas station. I sat there, shaking, before finally walking to the back of the car. The rear bumper was actually bent, scarred from the weight that shouldn't have been there. I popped the trunk, expecting it to be empty. It was, but sitting right in the center of the carpet was a heavy brass pen. I picked it up, and the moment my skin touched the metal, the gas station's outdoor speakers cut their music. A low, familiar voice came over the intercom, thanking me for the contribution and noting that while I had escaped the tunnel, I had carried the transmitter out with me. The pen in my hand began to click, all by itself. The midnight shift at the shipyard is a vacuum of salt air and rusting steel, usually silent enough for me to hear the coffee brewing in the break room. I was leaning against the guard shack window, thinking about how my wife always leaves the kitchen light on for me. A small, persistent annoyance that I'd give anything to see right now. The maritime radio on the desk didn't static. It simply shifted, the low-frequency hum of the harbor turning into the unmistakable sound of my own front door creaking open. I heard the jingle of my keys hitting the hallway bowl. Then my wife's voice drifted through the speakers, soft and heavy with sleep, asking if I'd remembered to pick up the milk. A voice answered her. It was my voice, but stripped of the exhaustion, sounding exactly as I did 10 years ago. I grabbed the radio, my thumb white against the dial, but the volume wouldn't budge. On the gate monitor, a man in my uniform was sitting in my car, his hands resting perfectly at 10 and 2 on the wheel. I hit the intercom, shouting for him to identify himself, but as I spoke, my throat felt like it was filling with sand. The more I screamed, the clearer the man on the radio became, his conversation with my wife flowing with a warmth I hadn't managed to find since the shipyard took over my nights. I lunged for the phone to call home, a desperate need to warn her overriding the cold dread in my chest. I dialed the number, but as the line connected, a sharp, searing pain shot through my hand. I watched, paralyzed, as the skin on my palm began to smooth over, my unique scars and calluses fading into a waxy, featureless surface. On the radio, the man laughed at something she said, a joke I had been planning to tell her for weeks. By trying to reach her, I had given him the last piece of the bridge. The radio hissed, a voice that wasn't mine whispering that the update was holding. The figure on the monitor stepped out of the car. He walked toward the shack, pausing for a second to adjust his collar, a small, human hesitation that made my blood run cold. He looked like a man unsure of his first day on the job, a detail so intimate it felt more violent than a physical blow. I grabbed the heavy iron wrench and swung it at the glass, but my arm felt like it was made of smoke. The wrench didn't shatter the window. It passed through the frame and clattered onto the pavement outside. I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor and saw only a blur of gray, a smudge where my face should be. The intruder reached the door. He didn't force it. He just stood there, watching me through the glass with eyes that were now vibrantly, undeniably mine. He spoke my name, and the sound of it felt like a final thread snapping. He told me he'd take care of the light in the kitchen. I tried to grab the door handle to keep him out, but my fingers wouldn't wrap around the metal. I was sliding into the corners of the room, my vision narrowing into the glowing amber light of the radio dial. He turned and walked back to my car, his footsteps heavy and solid, leaving me behind in the silence of the shack. The shipyard whistle blew for the shift change, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry the last of my weight away with it. I sat in the chair, or rather, I existed where the chair was. The radio didn't cut out. It stayed on, broadcasting the steady, rhythmic sound of my wife's breathing as she fell back to sleep. I could hear the rustle of the sheets and the distant hum of the refrigerator in a house I could no longer find. I was just a low-frequency vibration now, a bit of background noise she might notice only if the room grew too quiet. The Forest Fire Lookout Tower usually feels like a fortress of glass and steel, but tonight, the horizon was wrong. At 3 a.m., the radio on my desk began to output a low-frequency hum that made the dust motes in the room vibrate in midair. The signal light glowed a steady, sickly amber. A voice, sounding like it was being filtered through dry leaves, began to read a log of my shift. It wasn't my log. It was a minute-by-minute account of me sitting in the chair, staring at the radio, and reaching for a glass of water that I hadn't even touched yet. I looked at the glass. It was bone dry, coated in a layer of fine gray sediment that looked like wood ash. I checked the panoramic windows to scan for smoke, but the glass was frosted with that same gray dust on the outside. The radio voice grew louder, describing a thermal anomaly moving up the tower's western pylon. I looked at the monitor for the external camera, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a shadow. It was a man-shaped void, a gap in the world that moved with a jerky, hitching gait, dragging its long, scorched arms up the ladder. It didn't have a face, just a vertical slit in its head that pulsed with a faint orange glow. The radio hissed, the announcer noting that the subject was now aware of the stoker. The scratching started then, not on the door but on the windows. The long, blackened fingers of the entity outside scraped against the glass, leaving charred streaks behind. The radio voice began to play a recording of a fire department dispatch from 20 years ago, reporting a tower collapse in this exact sector. I realized the radio wasn't just observing me. It was syncing my present with a past event that I was supposed to be a part of. Every time the radio played the sound of a timber snapping in the recording, a localized heat bloom erupted in the room, the temperature spiking until the air tasted like copper and smoke. The creature outside stopped its scratching and pressed its chest against the glass. The orange glow from its head began to bleed through the pane, melting the dust into a liquid that looked like bubbling tar. The radio announcer told me to check the fire extinguisher. I grabbed it, but the canister was unnervingly light. When I pulled the pin, only a cloud of fine, gray ash billowed out, coating my hands. The voice on the air sighed, noting that the biological insulation was failing. I looked at my skin. The ash wasn't just on me, it was coming out of my pores, my arms turning the color of a spent hearth. The entity outside raised a heavy, blackened hand and began to rhythmically tap on the glass. The radio synced with the tapping, the voice counting down each strike. It wasn't trying to break in, it was pacing the burn. With every tap, the room became more transparent, the walls flickering between solid steel and charred, skeletal remains. I realized the entity wasn't a monster trying to get in. It was the anchor. It was holding the reality of the fire in place until I was fully consumed by the memory. I lunged for the trapdoor, but my boots left charred footprints on the floor, and the wood beneath the lina was already glowing red. I finally managed to throw the door open, but there was no ladder. Below the tower was nothing but a sea of rolling, orange embers that stretched to the horizon. The radio voice, now sounding perfectly clear and devoid of static, thanked me for completing the cycle. It played the sound of a single, heavy bolt sliding into place. I looked back at the window. The entity was gone, and in its place was a reflection of me. But I was the one with the vertical slit in my head, pulsing with that same dying orange light. I didn't fall. I simply drifted into the heat. The last thing I heard from the radio was a new voice, young and terrified, calling in a heat signature from the valley floor. The announcer responded by reading the coordinates of the tower I had just left, starting the log for the next man who would sit in that chair. I reached out to touch the air, but my fingers were now nothing more than smoke, curling upward to join the thick, black cloud that had been waiting for me since the broadcast began.